The security officer's voice cracked through the first-class cabin like a snapped cable. "Sir, stand up. Right now." The command hit harder than the turbulence that rattled the overhead bins. Conversations died mid-sentence. A fork clinked against porcelain. Somewhere behind the curtain, a glass shattered, the sound sharp and final. Every head turned toward seat 2C. Daniel Brooks did not stand. He sat very still, shoulders squared, hands resting flat on the armrests, as if he were anchoring himself to the aircraft. 64 years old, gray hair cut close, not styled, a face lined by decades of discipline, not softness. He wore a faded navy jacket, pressed but old, the kind men kept long after it stopped signaling anything. No logo, no shine, no visible wealth. Just a man who looked like he belonged in the background. The officer stepped closer. His badge glinted under the cabin lights. "Sir, I need you on your feet." Daniel lifted his eyes. Calm, steady, not defiant, not afraid. Just focused, like a surgeon before an incision. "I'm seated according to my boarding pass," he said. His voice was low, controlled, even. The flight attendant beside the officer shifted her weight. Rebecca Hale, late 40s, perfect posture, perfect smile, strained now at the edges. She kept one hand wrapped tightly around her tablet, knuckles pale. "Sir," she said, "please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder for who, Daniel wondered, but did not say. 15 minutes earlier, none of this had existed. Back then, first class had hummed with the quiet confidence of money and routine. Early morning flight from Baltimore to Phoenix, retirees heading west for winter, executives nursing black coffee. The air smelled of citrus wipes and fresh leather. Daniel had boarded early, nodded politely, stowed his bag, and taken his seat by the aisle. Not the window he'd requested, but he hadn't complained. He rarely did. Across from him, a man in a camel coat had glanced once, then looked away, interest already gone. To most people, Daniel Brooks registered as invisible, and for years that invisibility had been useful. The woman who changed everything arrived late. Carolyn Whitfield swept into the cabin with practiced urgency. 60 years old, blonde hair sculpted into something expensive and immovable, pearl earrings, designer coat still bearing the chill of the jet bridge. She stopped short when she saw Daniel in 2C. Her smile didn't falter. It hardened. "I believe you're in my seat," she said, loud enough to carry, not sharp, polite. The kind of politeness that assumed obedience. Daniel glanced at the numbers stitched into the headrest, then down at his boarding pass. 2C. He looked back up. "That's what it says." Carolyn tilted her head, studying him the way one assessed an unfamiliar piece of furniture. "There must be a mistake. I always sit here." She turned slightly, already looking past him for help. "Rebecca." Rebecca appeared instantly, as if summoned. "Ms. Whitfield, good morning. I didn't see you board." "Traffic," Carolyn replied. "You know how it is." She gestured vaguely toward Daniel. "There seems to be an issue." Rebecca glanced at Daniel's boarding pass, then at Carolyn. Her eyes lingered a fraction longer on Carolyn's face. Recognition, comfort, history. She smiled. "Let me take care of it." That was when the balance shifted. Rebecca asked for Daniel's boarding pass again, not once, but twice. She turned it over, tapped her tablet, frowned. That's odd." "What's odd?" Daniel asked. "Sometimes the system assigns seats incorrectly during updates," she said. Her tone softened, almost apologetic, but her eyes never quite met his. "Ms. Whitfield has a standing preference on this route." "Preference?" Daniel repeated quietly. Carolyn crossed her arms. "I have calls scheduled the minute we land. I need privacy." Daniel nodded. "As do I." That should have ended it. 2 adults, equal claim. A minor inconvenience solved with courtesy. Instead, Rebecca disappeared behind the curtain. Inside the galley, voices dropped. Names were exchanged. Carolyn Whitfield, longtime donor to the Airline's foundation, frequent flyer, known to complain directly to corporate. The last time she'd been unhappy, a supervisor had lost a bonus. That he was willing to wait while they verified. The second lie came quickly. System error. The third came sharper. Crew instruction. By the time the word uncooperative was whispered into a headset, the atmosphere had turned electric. And now, here they were. The security officer shifted his stance. Nearby passengers stared at their laps, suddenly fascinated by seat pockets. One woman 2 rows back watched everything, eyes narrowed, hands folded in her lap. Margaret Klein, 71, former city council attorney. She noted the sequence, the language, the escalation. Rebecca's tablet chimed. She flinched. "Sir, this is your final request." Daniel exhaled slowly. He could feel his heart beating now. Not fear. Anger, tightly leashed. Memories pressed in. Boardrooms where he'd been mistaken for staff. Hotels where his card key mysteriously failed. The familiar calculus of how far to push before the cost became unbearable. He thought of his wife, already in Phoenix. Of the meeting waiting at the other end of this flight. Of how easy it would be to stand, to move, to disappear again. Instead, he stayed seated. "I'd like to speak to the captain," he said. The officer laughed once, short and incredulous. "That's not how this works." Carolyn smiled, thin, victorious. Then Margaret Klein stood. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was old but firm. "I'm a retired attorney, and I'd like to know why this gentleman is being threatened with removal when he's done nothing but sit quietly." The cabin froze. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it. The officer hesitated. Mark appeared, flushed. "Ma'am, please sit down." Margaret didn't. "I've been watching, and I've been timing. You questioned him 3 times. You didn't question her once." Carolyn's smile slipped. Daniel felt something shift. Not relief, momentum. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tense. "What seems to be the problem up there?" Rebecca swallowed.
"Sir, we have a passenger refusing to comply."
Daniel finally stood. Not because he was told to, because he chose to. He rose slowly, towering just enough to change the geometry of the space. He looked at the officer, then at Rebecca, then at Carolyn. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he said, "and this isn't about a seat." Somewhere, in a quiet office far from this cabin, a phone began to ring. The captain's silence stretched too long, thick as smoke. Mark Ellis cleared his throat. "Captain, we have a seating compliance issue in first class. Passenger is refusing crew instruction." Daniel didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Rebecca. She had gone pale beneath the makeup, lips pressed tight, tablet trembling slightly in her hand. For the first time since boarding, she looked uncertain. "Refusing," Daniel said quietly, "implies I've been given a lawful reason. I haven't." The security officer shifted again, hand hovering near his radio. The cabin felt smaller now, airless. Somewhere behind Daniel, a man muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. Carolyn Whitfield adjusted her coat, impatience flashing through the cracks of her composure. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I'm the one being inconvenienced here." Margaret Klein turned her head slowly.
No, she said. You're the one being indulged.
Carolyn scoffed.
And who are you supposed to be? Someone who spent 40 years watching systems justify themselves, Margaret replied. Sit down.
A murmur rippled through the cabin, not loud, but present. Rebecca finally found her voice.
Ma'am, please, we're trying to keep this orderly.
Orderly, Daniel repeated. He smiled faintly. Funny word. The captain's voice returned, sharper now. Mark, I need specifics. Why is security in my cabin before pushback? Mark hesitated, long enough for the pause to become an answer. There's a VIP seating preference conflict, he said, and the gentleman won't relocate. Won't, Daniel corrected. Shouldn't have to. Another pause. Longer. Is his boarding pass valid? The captain asked. Rebecca answered too fast. There may have been a system irregularity. May have, Daniel said, or may not. The security officer leaned closer. Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to escort you off the aircraft. Escort implies force, Daniel said. Are you ordering me to leave my seat? The officer didn't answer. Margaret Klein inhaled sharply. Captain, she said loudly, I'm formally requesting this interaction be documented, as a witness. Mark spun toward her. Ma'am, this isn't— I know exactly what this is, Margaret cut in, and I know what it becomes if you keep going. Carolyn laughed, brittle. Threats now? No, Margaret said. Consequences. Daniel felt the room tilt, not toward him, toward truth. Rebecca's tablet chimed again. She glanced down, then up at Mark. Her eyes widened slightly. Mark shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Not now. What is it? Daniel asked. Rebecca swallowed. Nothing. The captain's voice came back, lower, colder. Mark, I'm looking at the manifest. That seat was sold. Why wasn't this resolved quietly? Because Ms. Whitfield has a note on her profile, Mark said. We were honoring. A note, the captain interrupted, is not an override. Silence. Carolyn's jaw tightened. Daniel felt the familiar pull to de-escalate, to offer an exit. He had done it 1,000 times in rooms like this, absorbed the inconvenience to spare others discomfort. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. Captain, he said, I don't want anyone removed. I want the rules applied as written. Margaret nodded once. That's the line. Carolyn stared at Daniel now, really stared. Her eyes moved over his jacket, his shoes, his face. Something like calculation flickered there. She leaned toward Rebecca, quietly. Do you know who he is? Rebecca hesitated, then shook her head. Carolyn straightened, lips thinning. Then why are we wasting time? Because you're not used to hearing no, Margaret said. Mark's radio crackled. A voice from operations, tense. Mark, we need to pause. Corporate is asking questions. Mark closed his eyes for a beat, opened them. Captain, perhaps we should ask the passenger to step into the galley to talk privately. Daniel shook his head. No. Mark bristled. Sir, this is exactly how it happens, Daniel said. Quiet hallway, no witnesses. Words rearranged later. The cabin was fully alert now. Heads up, phones tucked but ready. The sense of something irreversible hovered. The captain exhaled audibly over the intercom. I'm coming back. Rebecca's shoulders sagged. Mark shot her a look. She looked away. The security officer stepped back half a pace. Uncertainty had crept into his posture. Carolyn noticed. Her confidence wavered.
"This is unbelievable," she muttered. Daniel turned to her for the first time. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, "you'll still get where you're going today. So will I."
The difference is whether this ends quietly or honestly. She met his gaze, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't before. This man was not bluffing, not performing. He wasn't angry enough to be reckless, nor afraid enough to be coerced. She looked away first. The captain appeared through the curtain, tall, gray at the temples, eyes sharp with irritation and concern. He took in the scene in one sweep. Security, standing passenger, taut faces. "What's going on?" he asked, not over the intercom now. Here. Real. Mark began to explain. The VIP note, the preference, the refusal. The captain listened, then turned to Daniel. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Daniel handed it over without comment. The captain studied it, then looked at Rebecca, then Mark, then Carolyn. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, "your seat assignment today is 4A. Carolyn's mouth opened, closed.
"That's not acceptable."
"It is," the captain said evenly. She stared at him, incredulous. "Do you know who I am?" The captain held her gaze. "Yes." Daniel felt a subtle shift again. Not victory, not yet, but alignment. Margaret Klein smiled to herself. Carolyn gathered her bag with sharp movements, cheeks flushed.
"This airline is going to hear about this."
"We already have," the captain said. She froze. Slowly, she turned.
"What does that mean?"
The captain handed Daniel his boarding pass back. "Thank you for your patience, sir." Daniel nodded. "Thank you for stepping in." Carolyn moved down the aisle, the click of her heels uneven now. Whispers followed her like a draft. Rebecca stood rigid, staring at the floor. Mark looked suddenly very tired. The captain addressed the cabin. "We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your cooperation." As he turned to leave, Daniel spoke. "Captain." The man paused. "This isn't over," Daniel said. "Not for them, not for you." The captain studied him. "I know." As the engines began to hum, Margaret leaned closer.
"You held the line,"
she said softly. Daniel sat back down, hands steady again. For now. Outside the window, ground crew waved. The plane began to move. And somewhere deep inside the airline's systems, a flag had been raised that would not be lowered quietly. The first bump of turbulence hit just as the seatbelt sign chimed on, a sharp jolt that rattled the cabin and snapped every remaining whisper into silence. Daniel Brooks barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the movement near the galley. On the way, Rebecca avoided his row entirely now, her steps precise, mechanical. On Mark Ellis, standing with his back half-turned, pretending to study a manifest he already knew by heart. On the way, power had shifted, not loudly, not cleanly, but unmistakably. Carolyn Whitfield sat rigid in 4A, her spine straight, hands folded too tightly in her lap. She had removed her coat, then put it back on again, a small, unconscious gesture of reclaiming armor. She did not look at Daniel. She did not need to. Her humiliation hummed in the air like static. Margaret Klein leaned back in her seat, eyes half closed, listening. She had seen this moment before, in courtrooms and conference rooms, when an institution realized too late that it had misjudged the wrong person. The tell was always the same. Sudden quiet, overcorrected politeness, fear disguised as procedure. Daniel felt it too. A flight attendant approached from the rear, younger, early 30s, nervous smile. She stopped beside Daniel's seat, hands clasped behind her back. "Sir, can I get you anything?" Daniel looked up. Her eyes flicked briefly to his face, then away. She was trying to read him, to decide what kind of man he was now that the rules had bent around him. "Just water," he said. She nodded quickly and hurried off. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came through again, smoother now. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now airborne and expect a smooth flight to Phoenix." Smooth. Mark Ellis exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding himself until the plane left the ground. He leaned into the galley wall, wiped his palms on his slacks. Rebecca stood beside him, staring at her tablet without seeing it. "Corporate flagged the seat conflict," Mark muttered. Rebecca stiffened. "Already?" Operations noticed the security request before pushback. He glanced toward Daniel's row. Someone up there asked questions. Rebecca swallowed. "I was following the notes." Mark's jaw tightened. "You followed habit." A chime sounded on Rebecca's tablet. She read the message. Her face drained of color. "Mark," she whispered. "What?" She turned the screen toward him. "Subject line only. Passenger escalation. Legal copied." Mark closed his eyes. In the cabin, Daniel felt his phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. He didn't reach for it immediately. He knew who it would be. The timing was too precise. Margaret noticed the vibration. She watched him choose not to respond. Interesting, she thought. Most men in his position would already be maneuvering. Carolyn, across the aisle, glanced down the row, saw Daniel's phone light fade back to dark. Her fingers curled slightly. Who was he that corporate would care this fast? The water arrived. Daniel thanked the attendant. He took a sip, measured, then set the cup down carefully. He reached into his pocket at last and checked the message. One line. "Are you safe?" He typed back with his thumb. "Yes." Another vibration followed immediately. "We saw the flag." Daniel's mouth tightened. He looked out the window instead, watching the ground fall away, the city shrinking into geometry. He thought of the countless times flags had not been raised, when nothing had happened, when silence had been the system's preferred response. Margaret leaned closer again. "They've noticed," she said under her breath. Daniel nodded once. "Good," she replied. "Now it's real." In the galley, Rebecca paced in place. Her mind replayed the sequence again and again. The way she'd asked for the boarding pass, the way she hadn't asked the other woman. She'd told herself it was efficiency, experience, the unwritten rules you learned after years in the air. But the look on the captain's face when he'd said, "A note is not an override," that had cut deeper than any reprimand. Mark's phone buzzed. He stepped away to answer, voice low. Yes, I understand." He glanced toward the cabin again. "Yes, he's still on board." "Yes, understood." He ended the call and stared at the floor. Rebecca stopped pacing. "What did they say?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "They want statements." Rebecca's breath caught. "Now, as soon as we reach cruising altitude." She pressed her lips together. "We didn't break any rules." Mark looked at her. "Did we?" She didn't respond. In 4A, Carolyn Whitfield finally leaned toward the aisle. "Excuse me," she said sharply to the passing attendant. "I need to make a call." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant replied. "Once we reach altitude." Carolyn's eyes flicked toward Daniel. Her voice dropped. "This delay is unacceptable." The attendant hesitated. "Just a few more minutes." Carolyn leaned back, fury simmering beneath the surface. She had spent decades learning how to leverage inconvenience into compliance. Today, it had failed her. And failure, she knew, left marks. Daniel sensed her gaze without looking. He knew the type. Not a villain. Worse. Someone who believed the system owed her something because it always had. His phone vibrated again. A call this time. He declined it. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Not yet," Daniel said quietly. "Smart," she murmured. "Let it unfold." The seatbelt sign dimmed. The cabin loosened by a degree. Conversations restarted cautiously. The captain emerged briefly, scanning first class with a measured look, then disappeared back into the cockpit. Rebecca straightened her uniform. Mark adjusted his tie. They stepped into the cabin together. "Sir," Mark said, stopping beside Daniel's seat, "we'll need to ask you a few follow-up questions regarding the earlier interaction." Daniel looked up at him. "Here." Mark hesitated. "In private might be preferable." "No," Daniel said again. Mark swallowed. "Very well." Margaret Klein folded her hands, attentive. Mark cleared his throat. "For our records, can you confirm whether you felt you were treated unfairly?" Daniel studied him. His eyes moved briefly to Rebecca, then back. "I was treated differently." "Based on what, sir?" "Based on assumptions," Daniel replied. "And convenience." Rebecca flinched. Mark nodded slowly, typing. "And what outcome are you seeking?" Daniel considered the question. He felt the weight of it. The easy answers, the dangerous ones. "I'm seeking consistency," he said, "and accountability." Mark stopped typing. He met Daniel's gaze for the first time since boarding. "And if corporate reaches out?" Daniel's phone vibrated again, insistent now. "Then I'll speak to them," Daniel said, "when I'm ready." Mark stepped back. "Thank you for your cooperation." As they moved away, Margaret leaned in once more. "They think this is contained," she said. Daniel allowed himself a thin smile. "It never is." Across the aisle, Carolyn watched the exchange with growing unease. She had lost something intangible, something she couldn't name, and she hated that more than the seat. The plane leveled off, engines settling into their steady roar, and somewhere far below, an institution began the slow, irreversible work of realizing it had been seen. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled out, the hum of the engines settling into a steady, relentless rhythm. It was the sound of inevitability. Daniel Brooks felt it in his chest, the moment after a decision, when there was no longer any turning back. Mark Ellis retreated to the galley, his posture rigid, his mind racing. He had filed reports before, minor incidents, complaints that evaporated into customer service inboxes and were never mentioned again. This was different. He could feel it. The captain's tone, corporate's speed, the way the security officer had backed off without being told. Rebecca stood a few feet away, staring at a tray of untouched glasses. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal. She looked older somehow, tired in a way sleep would not fix. "This was never supposed to happen," she said quietly. Mark didn't look at her. "It always happens, just not to us." In first class, Daniel sat motionless, eyes forward, hands folded loosely now instead of gripping the armrests. The tension had not left him. It had simply changed shape. He knew this phase well. The polite phase. The part where institutions pretended the worst was over because the noise had stopped. Across the aisle, Margaret Klein watched Rebecca return to service. Daniel did not look back. Rebecca typed, fingers stiff. "And the cause of your dissatisfaction?" Carolyn hesitated, just long enough. Then she said,
I was displaced from my usual seat. Usual, Margaret repeated softly to herself. Rebecca glanced toward the galley, then back to Carolyn. I've documented your concern. Carolyn leaned back, unsatisfied. I expect follow-up. You will I understand there was an incident during boarding. There was a pattern, Daniel replied. Another pause. Longer. We'd like to speak with you upon landing. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked straight ahead. No. No, sir. Not upon landing. Not privately. Not behind closed doors. Mr. Myers cleared his throat. We'd like to resolve this as efficiently as possible. Efficiency is how this happened, Daniel said. We'll talk later. On my terms. Silence. Then, I see. Daniel ended the call. Margaret exhaled slowly. There it is. Daniel turned his head slightly. What? They expected you to be grateful for the attention, she said. You weren't. He nodded once. In the galley, Mark watched Rebecca's face as she returned from Carolyn's row. She looked shaken. She's filing a complaint, Rebecca said. Mark gave a humorless laugh. Of course she is. Rebecca lowered her voice. Corporate already called. Mark stiffened. What did they say? That they're escalating. Rebecca swallowed. That the passenger in 2C is sensitive. Mark closed his eyes. Sensitive is code. For what? For liability. Mark leaned back against the wall. He pictured his kids. Tuition bills. The fragile illusion of stability he'd been clinging to since the divorce. He had convinced himself he was protecting the airline, the crew, himself. Now he wasn't sure who he'd really been protecting. In the cabin, the captain emerged briefly, walked the aisle, nodded to a few passengers. When he reached Daniel, he paused. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, I want you to know I've reported the incident fully. Daniel met his eyes. I believe you. The captain hesitated. That doesn't mean it will be handled the way it should. Daniel considered him, then said, That depends on what you do next. The captain nodded once, then moved on. Carolyn watched the exchange with a tightening jaw. Something was slipping away from her. Control, narrative. She had spent her life mastering both. She leaned toward the aisle again, catching Margaret's eye. You seem very invested in this, she said coolly. Margaret smiled without warmth. I'm invested in fairness. Carolyn scoffed. You don't know the whole story. Margaret's gaze flicked to Daniel, then back. I know enough. The rest of the flight unfolded in a strange, suspended calm. Drinks were served, meals offered, polite smiles stretched thin. No one mentioned what had happened, but no one forgot it either. Daniel ate little. His appetite had vanished hours ago. He sipped water, stared at the window, watched clouds drift past like indifferent witnesses. He thought of the first time this had happened to him, decades earlier, a conference hotel, a misplaced assumption. He had laughed it off then, told himself it wasn't worth the fight. He had been wrong. Margaret noticed his reflection in the glass, the way his jaw tightened, then relaxed. The man was carrying more than this flight. Carolyn finally closed her eyes, exhaustion creeping in. She told herself this would blow over, that it always did, that systems protected their own. But something about the way the crew moved now, cautious and watchful, unsettled her. The plane began its descent. The captain's voice filled the cabin, steady but weighted. We'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated until we reach the gate. As the city rose up beneath them, Daniel felt the familiar mix of resolve and fatigue settle into his bones. He knew what waited on the ground. Questions. Meetings.
resistance disguised as contrition. But he also knew something else. This time, the door had not closed quietly. It had been held open. The wheels hit the runway with a muted thud that reverberated through the cabin, a physical punctuation mark at the end of a flight that had already changed its destination long before the plane touched ground. Daniel Brooks didn't move. Around him, seatbelts clicked open, bags were pulled down, voices returned in cautious fragments. Normalcy rushed back too quickly, eager to bury what had happened 30,000 feet above the desert. But the tension did not lift. It clung to the air like the smell of burned coffee. Carolyn Whitfield stood the moment the plane slowed, then stopped herself when the aisle failed to clear. Her impatience surfaced again, sharp and reflexive. She glanced toward the front, then back at Daniel. He remained seated, hands folded, eyes forward. He looked neither triumphant nor defeated, just resolved. Margaret Klein waited. She always waited. The captain's voice came over the intercom, measured and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Phoenix. Please remain seated until we are parked at the gate." The pause that followed was deliberate. Then his tone shifted. "Before we deplane, I need to make a brief announcement." Rebecca froze halfway through collecting a tray. Mark Ellis closed his eyes. "This morning," the captain continued, "an incident occurred during boarding that did not reflect the standards of professionalism and fairness this airline is committed to. We are reviewing the matter at the highest level. I appreciate your patience." The announcement ended. Silence filled the cabin. Carolyn's face flushed. She had not expected that. Not publicly. Not with witnesses. She sat back down slowly, lips pressed thin, eyes darting toward the aisle as if searching for an exit that did not exist. Margaret exhaled through her nose. "There it is," she murmured. Daniel felt the weight shift again, not toward vindication, toward consequence. The plane reached the gate. The engines powered down. The usual rush to stand did not come. First class hesitated, sensing something unfinished. Then the curtain at the front parted. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, badges clipped discreetly at their waists. Behind them, a woman in a charcoal blazer, hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp and assessing. Airline operations, legal, human resources. The order was unmistakable. Rebecca's breath caught. Mark's stomach dropped. The woman scanned the cabin, then locked eyes with Daniel. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "may we speak with you briefly?" Daniel rose calmly, not hurried, not reluctant. He nodded once. "Here." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Very well." The suits positioned themselves nearby, not blocking, observing. Carolyn stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," she said. "I've been inconvenienced enough. I want this addressed immediately." The woman turned to her. "Ms. Whitfield, we are aware of your concerns. They will be addressed separately." "Separately," Carolyn repeated. The word tasted bitter. "Yes," the woman said. "Separately." Carolyn sank back into her seat. The cabin watched. No one spoke for her now. The woman faced Daniel again. "I'm Elaine Porter, Director of Corporate Compliance. I want to apologize for what you experienced today." Daniel held her gaze. Apologies are easy. Systems are harder. Elaine nodded. "That's why I'm here." She gestured subtly toward the galley. "Mark Ellis, Rebecca Hale, please remain on board." Rebecca swayed slightly. Mark stiffened. They exchanged a look that said everything neither wanted to admit. Passengers began to deplane slowly, deliberately. Some avoided eye contact. Others nodded at Daniel.
A few murmured quiet words of support. Margaret touched his arm lightly as she passed. "You did the right thing," she said. Daniel inclined his head. "Thank you for standing up." She smiled. "I've been waiting a long time to do it again." Carolyn remained seated until last. When she finally rose, her movements were controlled, precise. She stopped beside Daniel, close enough for only him to hear. "You've made a mistake," she said. "You don't understand how this..."
That's why this matters. She scoffed softly, then walked away, heels striking the floor with brittle certainty. In the galley, Mark sat heavily on a jump seat, hands clasped. Rebecca stood rigid, arms folded tight across her chest. Elaine Porter faced them both.
"We've reviewed preliminary data," Elaine said. "This route, this time slot, similar complaints, patterns." Mark opened his mouth. "We were following custom," Elaine finished. "Habit, assumption." Rebecca's voice shook. "We never meant to single anyone out." "Intent is irrelevant," Elaine said. "Impact is not." She turned to Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, we'd like to understand what outcome you believe is appropriate." Mark looked up sharply. Rebecca did too. Daniel considered the question. He felt the weight of it settle across the narrow galley. He could feel the power now. Real power. The kind that could end careers, reshape policy, settle scores. He did not reach for it. "I don't want anyone fired to make this disappear," he said. "I want it changed so it doesn't repeat." Elaine studied him. "Changed how?" Daniel's voice was steady. "Documented seat preferences should never override confirmed assignments. Security escalation must require objective criteria, and every deviation needs to be logged and reviewed, not excused." Elaine nodded slowly. "You're describing a protocol." Daniel met her gaze. "Then write it." Mark's breath caught. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Elaine straightened. "We will. And we'll need your input." Daniel shook his head. "You'll need your data and your courage. I'll provide oversight, not cover." Elaine absorbed that, then nodded. "Understood." She turned to Mark and Rebecca. "You'll both be placed on administrative leave pending review." Rebecca's face crumpled. Mark stared at the floor. "This isn't punishment," Elaine added. "It's accountability." Daniel looked at them one last time. "Change doesn't start with good intentions," he said quietly.
It starts with uncomfortable truth. He stepped past them and onto the jet bridge. Cameras flashed at the far end of the terminal. Voices called out, "Mr. Brooks, sir, comment." Daniel walked straight ahead, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. "No comment," he said once, without slowing. Behind him, inside the aircraft, a system had begun to turn. Not loudly, not cleanly, but irrevocably. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel Brooks felt something he had almost forgotten. Not victory, momentum. The terminal swallowed him whole. Fluorescent light, polished floors, the familiar smell of coffee and jet fuel. Daniel Brooks moved through it all with measured steps, the noise washing over him without touching. Reporters clustered near the barrier, voices overlapping, cameras flashing like heat lightning. He did not slow. Security guided him just far enough, then let him go. No escort beyond that. No spectacle. That mattered. Outside, the desert heat pressed in, dry and unforgiving. Daniel paused under the overhang, breathed once, deep. The adrenaline that had carried him through the flight began to drain, leaving behind the heavier weight beneath it. Fatigue. Not of the body, of repetition. His phone rang. This time he answered. Daniel. The voice was familiar, calm, grounded. Ruth Brooks, his wife. He closed his eyes. I'm here, he said. I know, I've been watching. Her pause was brief but loaded. Are you all right? He considered the question honestly. I'm intact. That earned a quiet breath from her end. She knew his language. Intact meant upright. It did not mean untouched. I'll meet you at the hotel, she said. No press, no meetings, just food and quiet. He allowed himself a faint smile. That sounds perfect. When he hung up, he noticed a woman standing a few feet away, waiting. Mid-50s, short gray hair, simple blazer. No badge, no camera. She held a folded legal pad in one hand, like an old habit. Mr. Brooks, she said. My name is Angela Foster. I represent the airport authority. I wanted to thank you. For what? Daniel asked. For not letting this disappear, she replied. We see fragments, rarely the full picture. Daniel studied her. You're seeing it now. She nodded. Because you forced the system to look at itself. Inside the terminal, 2 floors above, Elaine Porter stood in a glass-walled conference room, jacket off now, sleeves rolled. Screens lined the walls. Timelines, incident reports, passenger data. She listened as analysts spoke, barely interrupting. This isn't isolated, one said. Similar language, same routes, same escalation points. Elaine leaned forward. Patterns don't form by accident. A younger analyst hesitated. If this becomes public, it already is, Elaine said. The question is whether we pretend it isn't. She tapped the table once. Draft a provisional framework. Mandatory verification steps. No discretionary overrides without documentation. Security escalation only after objective triggers. Every exception logged. Someone swallowed. That's a lot of oversight. Good, Elaine replied. Comfort is not our metric. Back on the curb, Daniel's driver pulled up. He slid into the back seat, watched the airport recede through tinted glass. His phone buzzed again. A message this time. Elaine Porter. We're initiating a company-wide review. I'd like to involve you in an advisory capacity. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment before typing. I'll listen. I won't lend my name unless it's real. He sent it, then set the phone down. The hotel was quiet. Desert modern. Glass, stone, shade. Ruth was waiting in the lobby, posture relaxed but eyes sharp. She crossed the space between them without hesitation and took his face in her hands. You look older than you did this morning, she said softly. He huffed once. I feel older. They went upstairs without speaking to anyone else. Later, as dusk settled, Daniel sat on the balcony, watching the sky burn itself out in reds and purples. Ruth brought him a plate, set it down beside him, then joined him in silence. After a while, she spoke. They're calling it an incident. He nodded. They always do. And you, she asked, are you ready for what comes next? He thought of the crew, of Mark's fear, Rebecca's tears, Carolyn's fury, of Margaret Klein's steady voice, of the woman on the jet bridge who had said thank you without spectacle. No, he said, but I never am. The night deepened. In a boardroom across town, executives gathered around a table that gleamed too brightly. Lawyers spoke carefully. PR advisors circled words like predators. One sentence repeated again and again. We need to contain this.
A voice at the far end cut through. Older, controlled. CEO. Containment is what caused it. Silence followed. Elsewhere, Mark Ellis sat alone in his kitchen, tie discarded, lights off.
His phone lay face down on the table. He stared at nothing, replaying every choice that had felt small at the time. He understood now that small choices stacked. They always did. Rebecca sat in her car in the parking lot, hands still on the wheel, though the engine was off. She watched a couple walk past, laughing, free. She wondered how many times she had smiled and smoothed things over, believing she was keeping peace, never seeing who paid the price for it. Carolyn Whitfield poured herself a drink in her hotel room and did not enjoy it. Her phone buzzed with messages she ignored. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar coil in her chest. Irrelevance. Back on the balcony, Ruth reached for Daniel's hand. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. He squeezed her fingers. "I know." But he also knew something else. That if he stepped back now, the machine would reset. That momentum required pressure. That systems did not change because they were asked nicely. His phone buzzed once more. Elaine again. "Preliminary draft ready. We're calling it the Brooks Standard for now." Daniel closed his eyes. "Change never arrives gently," Ruth said. "No," he agreed. "It arrives because someone refuses to move." Far above the city, planes traced white lines across the darkening sky, orderly and precise. Inside them, people sat in assigned seats, trusting invisible systems to treat them fairly. Daniel Brooks knew better now, and because of that, so would they. Morning arrived without apology. Daniel Brooks woke before the alarm, the desert light already pushing through the curtains in thin, relentless lines. His body felt heavy, but his mind was sharp, already moving ahead of the day. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city waking up below. No sirens, no voices, just distance. It reminded him of hospital mornings long ago, the brief calm before rounds, before decisions that could not be undone. Ruth slept beside him, breathing slow and even. He watched her for a second longer than necessary, then slipped out of bed and dressed quietly. Simple clothes, no suit, no signals. By the time the coffee arrived, his phone was already alive. 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail, all from different numbers, all carrying the same weight. Corporate, legal, media intermediaries pretending not to be media. He ignored them. Instead, he opened the document Elaine Porter had sent overnight. The draft was longer than he expected. Dense, careful. Every word built to withstand scrutiny. Daniel read it line by line, his jaw tightening at familiar phrases. Discretionary authority, operational flexibility, case by case. He highlighted them, deleted them, replaced them with something colder. Mandatory, verifiable, recorded. Ruth appeared in the doorway, robe loose around her shoulders. "You're already rewriting the world," she said. "Just trying to keep it from lying to itself," he replied. She sat across from him, took a sip of coffee. "They won't like that. They never do." His phone rang again. This time he answered. "Mr. Brooks," Elaine said. "Thank you for reviewing the draft so quickly." "You're still hedging," Daniel said. Before she could respond, "You want reform that looks reasonable. I want reform that survives pressure." There was a pause, then a small exhale. "That's why we asked you." "Good," he said. "Then listen carefully." He spoke for several minutes. Ruth watched his face as he did, the way his voice stayed calm while his eyes hardened. He was not negotiating. He was defining terms. When the call ended, Ruth leaned back. "You're not leaving them much room." "They've had room for decades," Daniel said. "That's the problem." At the airport, 3 floors above the terminal, a temporary operations center had been set up overnight. Screens glowed with maps, flowcharts, incident logs. Elaine stood at the center of it, arms crossed, listening as department heads argued in increasingly careful tones. "If we lock down discretion completely," one executive said, "we risk operational paralysis." Elaine didn't look at him. "Then we'll discover how often paralysis was confused with fairness." Another voice cut in. "The Brooks Standard sets precedent. Other passengers will demand the same transparency." Elaine turned. "Yes, that's the point." In the corner, a younger analyst raised her hand. "What about the crew involved?" Elaine's jaw tightened. "Accountability will be individualized. Systems will be addressed collectively. One without the other is theater." The room fell quiet. Across town, in a quiet cafe far from the airport, Margaret Klein folded her newspaper and watched the morning news play silently on the mounted screen. Headlines scrolled. Passenger dispute, airline review, CEO silent. She smiled faintly. Silence, she knew, was rarely empty. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Margaret Klein. Yes. "Ms. Klein, this is Elaine Porter. I understand you were a witness yesterday." Margaret leaned back. "You understand correctly. Would you be willing to submit a statement?" Margaret considered. "I already have one written." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course you do." In another part of the city, Mark Ellis sat across from a union representative in a bland office that smelled faintly of disinfectant. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. "They're saying administrative leave," Mark said. "Pending review." The representative nodded. "That's standard." Mark swallowed. "I didn't think. I know," the man said gently. "Most people don't." Mark stared at the table. He had spent years believing he was neutral, professional, that the system was bigger than him. Now he saw the cracks, and his fingerprints all over them. Rebecca Hale sat alone in her apartment, curtains drawn against the sun. Her uniform hung untouched on the back of a chair. She stared at her phone, then finally opened the message she'd been avoiding. Administrative leave, effective immediately. She closed her eyes. She thought of every time she'd said, "Let me take care of it," believing she was smoothing rough edges. She wondered how many times she had sharpened them instead. Back at the hotel, Daniel buttoned his jacket and stood by the door. The conference would begin in less than an hour. He was scheduled to speak on medical innovation, on ethics in systems design. The irony did not escape him. Ruth adjusted his collar. "You don't have to mention any of this," she said. He met her eyes. "I won't. Not directly." She nodded. "They'll hear it anyway." The ballroom was already filling when Daniel arrived. Rows of chairs, low murmur. Professionals with notebooks and expectations. He stepped onto the stage without announcement, the room settling instinctively. He looked out over the crowd. Older faces, experienced ones, people who had built systems and lived with their consequences. He began to speak, not about airplanes, not about seats. He spoke about assumptions, about how systems inherited the blind spots of the people who designed them, about how friction was often labeled disruption when it was really information. He spoke slowly, carefully, each sentence deliberate. In the back of the room, a woman took notes faster than anyone else. Elaine Porter, watching from a discreet distance. Daniel never raised his voice. He didn't need to. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then applause. Not explosive, sustained. Outside, reporters waited. Daniel exited through a side door as promised. No statement, no comment. That afternoon, the draft became policy. Not finalized, not celebrated, but real. And by evening, other airlines began to call. Quietly, carefully, asking for copies, for guidance, for language. Change does not announce itself, Daniel knew. It spreads. That night, he and Ruth sat on the balcony again. The city lights flickered below. His phone rested face down between them, silent for once. "You did something today?" Ruth said. He shook his head. "No, I started something." She smiled. "That's always the harder part." Daniel looked out at the sky, dark and wide. Somewhere, a door had been wedged open, and it would not close easily now. The calls did not stop. They multiplied. Daniel Brooks watched the phone light up again and again on the hotel desk, each vibration a reminder that systems only found urgency when their equilibrium was threatened. He let them ring. There was a discipline to restraint. He had learned it in operating rooms, in negotiations, in moments where reacting too quickly surrendered control. Ruth sat across from him, reading, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. "You're doing it again," she said, without looking up. "Doing what?" "Listening without answering," she said. "You always do that when something larger than the room is forming." Daniel allowed himself a brief breath. "It's already forming. I'm just deciding how much of it I want to shape." Downstairs, in a ballroom that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and coffee, Elaine Porter stood before a long table of executives who had arrived in haste and irritation. Some wore travel creases. Others wore practiced calm. All of them wore concern. "The Brooks Standard is not a branding exercise," Elaine said. "It's a structural correction." One man leaned back, arms crossed. "You're proposing external audits on customer interaction." "On deviations," Elaine corrected. "On discretion that becomes pattern." A woman near the end of the table frowned. "You're implying bias." "I'm stating data," Elaine replied. "Bias is the explanation you choose afterward." A murmur moved through the room. "If this spreads," another executive said carefully, "it sets precedent beyond aviation." Elaine nodded. "Yes." Silence followed. Not resistance, calculation. Across town, in a quiet law office with framed certificates lining the walls, Margaret Klein dictated her statement. Her voice was steady, unhurried. The passenger was compliant throughout. The escalation was initiated by staff. The language used shifted from procedural to coercive. The presence of security altered the power dynamic unnecessarily. She paused, then added softly, "Intent was never discussed. Impact was unmistakable." The recorder clicked off. Margaret leaned back, eyes closing briefly. She felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction that something had been named. Sorrow that it had taken this long. At the airport, Mark Ellis returned his access badge. The plastic felt lighter than it should have. The security officer behind the desk avoided his eyes. "You'll be contacted," the officer said. Mark nodded. He stepped outside into the harsh afternoon sun and stood there for a moment, unsure where to go. He had spent years navigating terminals, schedules, expectations. Now, stripped of the uniform, he felt exposed. His phone buzzed. Rebecca. He hesitated, then answered. "I don't know how this happened," she said immediately. Her voice was tight. "I thought I was helping." So did I, Mark replied. And that scared him more than the accusation. In a hotel suite several floors above the city, Carolyn Whitfield watched a news segment replay without sound. Her name did not appear. Daniel's did not either. That omission irritated her more than any headline. She poured herself another drink and did not finish it. Her phone lay untouched. Messages from colleagues sat unread. She sensed the shift. Not yet public condemnation. Something quieter. Invitations not extended, calls not returned. For the first time, she wondered what it felt like to be unseen. Daniel stood by the window as the sun dipped low. The city below seemed unchanged. Cars moved, people hurried, systems continued. That was always the illusion. Change never looked like change while it was happening. Elaine arrived that evening without ceremony. No entourage, no press. She carried a thin folder and the fatigue of someone who had not slept. They sat across from each other, silence stretching comfortably between them.
Other carriers reached out today, Elaine said, asking questions.
Daniel nodded. They will. Some want to adopt parts of the standard, quietly.
Quietly isn't enough,
Daniel said. But it's a start. Elaine hesitated.
There will be resistance. Internal, legal, cultural.
Of course there will be. He met her eyes. That's how you know it matters. She studied him.
You're aware this will follow you.
He smiled faintly. It already has. Later, after Elaine left, Ruth poured them both tea.
You're not done,
she said. No.
Are you tired?
Daniel considered the question. Bone tired, he said, but not empty. The night deepened. Across the country, in offices lit long past reasonable hours, policies were pulled from shelves. Language was examined. Loopholes identified. Quiet conversations began between people who had never questioned the way things were done. Not out of guilt, out of fear. Fear, Daniel knew, was an unreliable motivator. But it opened doors. He sat at the desk and opened a document of his own. Not policy, not rebuttal. Notes. Observations. The small moments that never made reports. The pauses. The looks. The choices that felt insignificant until they weren't. He wrote until his hand ached. In the early hours of the morning, Ruth woke to find him still there, staring at the screen.
Come to bed, she said.
In a minute. She came closer, rested her hand on his shoulder.
You can't hold the entire weight.
He leaned into her touch. I know, but I can hold my part. He closed the document without saving. Some things, he knew, were not meant to be finalized yet. Outside, the city slept. Above it, planes crossed the sky in quiet arcs, each one carrying people who trusted that where they sat would not become a battleground. Daniel Brooks knew that trust had been earned too slowly and broken too easily, and that once broken, it demanded more than apologies. It demanded design. The next morning would bring more calls, more meetings, more attempts to soften language and shorten memory. But something fundamental had shifted. Not because one man refused to move, but because that refusal had been seen, recorded, and translated into something systems could no longer ignore. And that, Daniel knew, as he finally lay down beside Ruth, was how real change began. The first headline appeared before sunrise. Daniel Brooks saw it not on his phone, but reflected faintly in the hotel mirror as Ruth scrolled beside him,
light from the screen cutting across the room like a blade. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't have to. Airline incident prompts industry review.
Careful. Bloodless. Already trying to drain the heat from it. Daniel tightened his tie, then loosened it again.
They're choosing their words.
Ruth nodded.
They always do, when they're afraid of choosing sides.
Downstairs, the conference center buzzed with low, controlled urgency. No cameras inside, no raised voices, just clusters of people speaking in the careful cadence of professionals who understood exactly what was at stake. Daniel moved through them unnoticed, which was its own kind of signal. Power was circling him now, waiting to see which way he would turn. Elaine Porter caught up to him near the coffee station. She looked exhausted, determined, the kind of resolve that came from knowing retreat was no longer an option.
3 carriers called overnight, she said. 1 regional, 2 international.
Daniel accepted a cup he didn't plan to drink.
Asking. Not asking, Elaine corrected. Testing language. Looking for safe ways to say they agree without committing. He nodded.
They'll commit when the pressure becomes external.
Elaine hesitated. That's the problem. Once it does, they'll frame it as your agenda.
Daniel met her eyes. Then we make it larger than me. In a windowless room 2 floors above, a group of legal advisors sat around a long table, documents spread like defensive fortifications. They spoke in clipped phrases: liability exposure, precedent risk, operational burden. One man leaned back, rubbing his temple. If this becomes standardized, we lose flexibility. Another replied quietly, we lose deniability. The room went still. Elsewhere, Margaret Klein sat at her kitchen table, reading the morning paper with deliberate slowness. Her statement had been quoted, though not by name. Witness described differential treatment. Pattern suggested. She smiled faintly. Language always caught up eventually. Her phone rang. Ms. Klein, a voice said. This is a producer with the evening news. We'd like to… No, Margaret replied, gentle but firm.
Not yet.
She hung up and returned to the paper. The story didn't need her face. It needed time. Back at the conference center, Daniel took the stage for a panel he had not requested and could not avoid. Ethics in Modern Systems. The irony was not lost on anyone. He waited for the applause to fade, looked out at the audience. Familiar faces, leaders, architects, people who believed in design and process and order. He did not mention the flight. Instead, he told a story about a hospital intake system that sorted patients by urgency but ignored pain because pain was subjective. About how outcomes improved only after they learned to measure what they dismissed as noise. Systems fail, Daniel said calmly, not because they're malicious, but because they mistake efficiency for fairness. He paused, let the words settle. The room leaned in. In the back row, a man took notes furiously. Elaine watched from the side, arms crossed, eyes sharp. By the time Daniel stepped off the stage, the room was quiet in a way that mattered. Outside, the press waited again. This time, Daniel stopped. He didn't answer questions. He didn't make statements. He said one sentence. This was never about a seat. It was about what happens when no one believes they're accountable. Then he walked away. The sentence spread faster than any interview could have. Across the city, in a sleek office overlooking the runway, airline executives watched the clip replay without sound. A woman at the head of the table turned to her team. "Draft the memo," she said. "We're adopting it." A man beside her frowned.
Quietly, she shook her head, publicly. Silence followed. Then, not.
Momentum was no longer theoretical. That afternoon, Elaine sent Daniel a message. First carrier committed. Full adoption. Press release pending. Daniel read it twice, set the phone down. Ruth watched his face. That's one. It's the first crack, he replied. At the airport, Mark Ellis sat in a small office across from a review board. He answered questions carefully, honestly. He did not excuse himself. He did not deflect. I didn't think of it as bias, he said. I thought of it as avoiding conflict. One of the board members nodded slowly. Avoiding conflict is how bias survives. Mark lowered his eyes. He understood that now. Rebecca Hale waited outside, hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Mark emerged, their eyes met. He didn't know what to say. The city below pulsed with life, unaware of the subtle rewiring happening in conference rooms and legal briefs. Elaine joined him quietly. It's moving faster than I expected, she said. Fear accelerates things, Daniel replied. So does clarity. She hesitated. You know they'll try to simplify you, make you a symbol or a villain. He nodded. Let them. Symbols are easier to fight than systems. She smiled faintly. You're difficult. He returned it. You're welcome. As she left, Daniel's phone buzzed again. Another message, another carrier, another request. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the sky, at the planes tracing their careful paths, each one following protocols written by people who believed rules could protect everyone equally. He knew better now. Rules protected intentions. Protocols protected outcomes. And outcomes, once measured, were hard to ignore. The story was no longer his. That was the point. Somewhere, a policy was being rewritten. Somewhere else, a training module was being revised. Somewhere still, a supervisor paused before making an assumption that once would have felt invisible. Small shifts, quiet, accumulating. Daniel Brooks took a breath. Tomorrow, there would be resistance, pushback, fatigue, attempts to reframe and reduce. But today, something irreversible had happened. The system had been forced to look at itself, and it had flinched. The following spring, Daniel Brooks boarded another flight from the same terminal, the same concourse, the same gate number that still lived in the memory of too many people for too many reasons. The difference this time was not the greeting, not the tone, not even the efficiency. Just ordinary. Daniel took his seat and felt the weight of the moment only because it wasn't announced. No one leaned in. No one hovered. No one whispered. Ordinary respect, given without ceremony, felt almost unfamiliar. Across the aisle, a gray-haired man struggled with an overhead bag. A flight attendant stepped in immediately, steady hands, patient smile. No sighs, no judgment. When the bag was secure, the man thanked her. She nodded and moved on. Daniel watched quietly. Behind the scenes, systems had changed. Training manuals rewritten, metrics adjusted. Complaints no longer filtered through a single lens. The new protocol did not ask who the passenger was. It asked what fewer moments where dignity had to be defended because it was no longer under threat. At the back of the cabin, Rebecca Hale sat with a tablet on her lap, reviewing data from the previous quarter. She paused when she noticed Daniel glance her way. She gave a small nod. Not gratitude, not apology. Recognition. The engines began to hum. The plane pushed back from the gate. As it taxied forward, Daniel closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound ground him. Progress, he had learned, rarely felt triumphant. It felt quiet, uneventful. Sometimes, He resisted interviews that framed the story around his success rather than the system's failure. He insisted on one thing only: that the changes remain even when his name faded from memory. Because that was the point. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky, sunlight cutting across the cabin. Somewhere below, another person would board another flight, unaware of what had shifted, unaware of what had been fought for. They would simply be treated as they should have been all along. Daniel looked out the window, watching the ground fall away, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Not pride, not relief, just resolve. The work was never finished, but the line